Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be going over the behavioral neuroscience lecture for the sci-MI program. So I'll first go over our table of contents. We'll first discuss what is behavioral neuroscience, then tasks in animals, tasks in humans, manipulating behavior, visualizing behavior, and finally some conclusions. Now, before we begin, I want to note that we'll be covering a wide range of topics and tasks. Because of this, I won't be able to go into detail on each one. However, each slide includes references to scientific articles if you're interested in exploring any of these topics further. Keep in mind as well that this lecture is just an introduction and doesn't cover everything within the field of behavioral neuroscience. If anything sparks your interest, I encourage you to explore the field further on your own. So what is behavioral neuroscience? It's an interdisciplinary field dedicated to understanding the biological and neural underpinnings of complex behaviors and to study behaviors in their own right, separate from connected neural processes. It integrates methodology from many disciplines, including neurobiology, psychology, pharmacology, physiology, and computational modeling, and so much more. But what can we study with behavioral research? Well, we can study lots. Drugs, executive function, neural networks, movement, decision-making, learning, emotional responses, motivation, memory, reinforcement, pain, reward, sleep, and so much more. So let's start with our tasks in animals here, and I'm going to start with tasks that we can use to study memory. Now, I want you to imagine that you keep your laptop in the same spot on your desk in your bedroom all the time. But one day, your sibling takes your laptop and leaves their iPad on your desk where your laptop should be. You would notice this immediately when you enter your bedroom because you remember that your laptop should be there, but it has been replaced with the iPad now. This is a great example to help you understand the following tasks I'm going to explain that we can use to study memory in rodents. It's also important to note that these tasks I'll be discussing in this section make use of a rodent's natural instinct to explore items that are new to a greater degree than items that are old. This task in particular is called the object recognition memory task. Firstly, in the training phase, an animal is placed in an area where there are two objects present, and their exploration of these objects is recorded. Then there's a delay, which can vary in length depending on what's being studied. In the test phase, the animal is placed back in the same area they were just in for the training phase, but this time one of the objects has been changed to a new one, like in my previous example where your laptop was switched out for your sibling's iPad. The animal's exploration of these objects will again be studied to determine if they recognize the new object as new. Now we have the object location memory task. The setup here is exactly the same as the object recognition memory task I just discussed. However, this time, instead of the actual object being changed between the training and testing phases, the location of one of the objects is changed instead. The researchers will therefore be determining if the animal recognizes the change of the object's location. And here we have the object in place task. This task is again similar to the last two that we just discussed, but here during the training phase, there are a number of objects present, and during the testing phase, the location of a few objects will be switched. The researchers here will be studying whether the animal detects this object location swap. Now I'll switch to assessments that can measure depression and anxiety. However, it's important that I mention that we can't reliably diagnose depression or anxiety in an animal, so these assessments will be studying what we refer to as depression-like or anxiety-like behaviors. This first task here that measures depression-like behaviors is called the force swim test. It involves placing an animal in a receptacle with water and monitoring their swimming and escaping behaviors. In this task, an animal that spends less time swimming or climbing and more time being immobile is said to be demonstrating depression-like behaviors. The sucrose preference test is another way we can measure depression-like behaviors. In this test, rodents are provided with two bottles, one that contains water and one that is a sweet solution like sucrose. Researchers measure how much an animal drinks from each bottle over a set period of time to determine its preference. Rodents naturally prefer sweet substances, so it is typical for rodents to demonstrate a sucrose preference in this test. Therefore, a rodent that has a reduced sucrose preference compared to what would be expected is said to be demonstrating depression-like behaviors. Now we'll move on to talk about tasks that measure anxiety-like behaviors. In the open field test, an animal is placed in a large open space, and the time they spend in the center and periphery of the space is measured. An animal that spends time in both the center and periphery, like the one on the top right of this image, is said to be demonstrating less anxiety-like behaviors than the animal on the bottom right of the image, which is spending all of its time in the periphery. These types of tasks work due to a rodent's natural prey instincts, where rodents avoid open, brightly lit spaces where they could be vulnerable to predators. The elevated plus maze is a similar task to the open field test. Here, there's an apparatus in the shape of a plus with the two arms that are enclosed and two arms that are open. Again, an animal that spends more time in the open arms is said to be demonstrating less anxiety-like behaviors than an animal that spends more time in the closed arms. Now we'll move on to talk about tasks that measure reward and reinforcement, but first, an important distinction. Tasks in this category use classical or operant conditioning to train animals prior to testing them. Classical conditioning trains an animal to associate an involuntary response with a stimulus. This is the classic Pavlov's dogs experiment, where dogs began to salivate at the sound of a bell that was consistently paired with access to food. Operant conditioning trains a subject to associate a voluntary response with a consequence. An easy example of this is when a dog sits when told to receive a treat. So the place conditioning task is an example of classical conditioning and involves a box with at least two chambers, as we can see here. An animal will receive consistent pairings of a stimulus, usually a drug, as we can see in this picture, on one side of the box, and pairings of a different stimulus, usually a placebo, on the other side of the box. On the test, researchers will place the animal in the middle of the two boxes and see which side of the box the animal spends more time in. If an animal spends more time in the side of the box where they received the drug, this may indicate that they found the drug and therefore its associated box to be rewarding. Self-administration is an example of operant conditioning, where an animal is trained to poke their nose, as seen here, or press a lever for a stimulus, which is usually a drug or food. Typically, as we can see here, one of the nose poke areas will provide access to a drug and the other will not. The animal will then increase their nose poking behavior in the correct area so that they can receive the drug. And now we'll move on to talk about tasks in humans. So because behavioral and cognitive neuroscience share many of the same research methods in humans, I'll only introduce a few behavioral tasks here. A separate lecture in the sci-MI program will cover cognitive neuroscience in much more detail. So for human tasks, we can have verbal tasks where participants will verbally respond. So for example, naming objects. We can have nonverbal tasks where participants physically respond, for example, by pressing buttons. And we can have observational research where there's no experimental manipulation and participants just act naturally within their environment. Now, a lot of the tasks that are done in humans can also be modified to be verbal or nonverbal. So the Stroop test is used to study cognitive interference. In this task, participants are asked to say the color of the fonts of words as quickly as possible. The twist is that the words themselves are color names, but they're printed in a different color, like the word red written in blue ink, as we can see here on the slide in the incongruent list. To respond correctly, the participant has to ignore what the word says and instead report the color of the font they see. This creates what's known as the Stroop effect, where people are consistently slower and make more mistakes when the word spells a color that conflicts with the font color. Now, the stop signal reaction time task measures a participant's ability to inhibit a response. Participants perform a fast go task, for example, classifying the direction an arrow is pointing, but must stop responding if a certain signal appears, which is known as the stop signal. In this example we see on the slide, a participant must classify whether an arrow is pointing to the left or right in quick succession. However, if they see an up arrow, they must stop responding. This task measures how quickly the brain can stop an action, where the faster an action can be stopped, the better a participant's inhibitory control is said to be. Now we'll discuss delayed matching tasks, which can be used to study memory. In the delayed matching to sample task, the participant is shown a sample image, then after a delay period, they must choose the image that matches the sample. In contrast, the delayed non-matching to sample task, here the participant must select the image that does not match the original sample. These delay periods let researchers measure how well information is maintained in memory over short intervals. And finally, here we have the ultimatum game, which is used to show how or study how people make decisions. It involves two players, a proposer and a responder. The proposer is given a sum of money, and they must decide how much of the sum they would like to offer the responder. The responder then chooses to either accept or reject the offer. If they accept, both players receive the proposed amount. But if they reject the offer, usually because it feels unfair, then neither player gets anything. This task allows researchers to see how people balance self-interest with fairness. And now we'll talk about manipulating behavior. So there's a few ways we can manipulate behavior in animals. We can temporarily manipulate behavior using drug administration. We can permanently manipulate behavior using genetic manipulations or lesions. And we can virally manipulate behavior using optogenetics or chemogenetics. So one of the ways we can temporarily manipulate behavior in animals is through the administration of drugs. Drugs can be administered in many ways to animals. For example, they can be injected into the body, or they can be injected directly into certain brain regions. Animals can also be administered drugs orally, either in their food, water, or some drugs can be administered directly into the stomach. Drugs can be used to change behavior in many ways. They can be used to increase, decrease, or stop certain behaviors and aspects of cognition, all depending upon what drug is given and at what dose. And now on to permanent manipulations. So we can also change an animal's genes to study how specific genes can affect behavior. There are three main ways to do this. Knocking down a gene means the gene is still there, but it works less than normal. Knocking out a gene means the gene is removed or completely turned off. And knocking in a gene means adding new genetic material so that the animal produces a new or modified version of that gene. Another way we can permanently change behavior in animals is by creating brain lesions, which means damaging a specific brain region to see how behavior changes. There are two main ways to do this. One method is to inject a chemical that destroys cells in a targeted area. And the other method is to physically damage a small part of the brain using a surgical tool, which is how we can model concussions. Both approaches help researchers figure out which brain regions are necessary for certain behaviors. And finally, we can manipulate behavior using viral techniques such as chemogenetics and optogenetics. These methods start by delivering a harmless virus into a specific part of an animal's brain. The virus makes certain neurons produce special receptors that can be controlled by the researcher. In chemogenetics, the researcher administers a chemical to the animal that activates the engineered receptors. And in optogenetics, the researcher shines a specific color of light into the brain to activate the receptors instead. By turning these neurons on or off at chosen moments, scientists can cause very precise changes in behavior. In humans, we have less control over behavioral manipulation due to ethical concerns, so we're only able to use certain temporary manipulations such as safe and well-studied drugs, brain stimulation, or therapeutic interventions. However, behavioral researchers can also make use of pre-existing differences in humans to understand how certain conditions may impact behavior. Examples of these conditions include genetic differences, lesions and disease, and disorders. So just like in animals, we can give drugs to humans that can alter their behavior. There are also many different types of drug administration we can use in humans, including pills and liquid medications, injections, nasal sprays, and creams. We can still study how drugs may increase, decrease, or stop certain behaviors and cognitive functions in humans like we can in animals. However, human research follows much stricter ethical guidelines than animal research, which means that some drugs cannot be studied in humans. Another way we can temporarily alter behavior in humans is through brain stimulation. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is a non-invasive procedure involving the placement of a small coil on the scalp, which delivers magnetic pulses to the brain to stimulate neurons. Deep brain stimulation, or DBS, is a much more invasive process that involves the surgical implantation of a pacemaker-like device that delivers electrical pulses to specific brain regions. Both TMS and DBS are used as medical treatments, especially for depression and movement disorders, respectively. And finally, we can also temporarily change behavior in humans using therapeutic interventions such as therapy, exercise, meditation, and more. Even though we have fewer ways to directly manipulate behavior in humans because of ethical constraints, we can still learn a lot by studying people who already have natural differences. For example, twin studies are a powerful way to understand the roles of nature versus nurture, since identical twins share the same genes. We can also study people who have genetic variations in certain receptors or neurotransmitter systems to see how these differences relate to behavior. And finally, we can study individuals with genetic disorders, such as Huntington's disease or Down syndrome, to understand how specific genes influence brain function and behavior. We can also learn about behavior by studying people who have experienced brain damage or disease. For example, traumatic brain injuries can lead to changes in personality and decision-making. One of the most famous cases is Phineas Gage, who we can see here, who survived a severe accident at work and showed dramatic behavioral changes afterwards. We can also study people who have experienced medical events such as strokes or infections that infect the brain like rabies. And finally, individuals with neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's disease provide important insights into how disease can affect behavior. And finally, here we can study how people with certain brain-related conditions may show behavioral patterns that differ from those without the condition. Examples include conditions such as dyslexia, ADHD, and autism. And now we'll talk about visualizing behavior. So the first and most simple way that we can visualize behavior is through observation. To do this, we can use videos or monitor behavior live as it's happening, or we can do both. Behaviors are typically counted, which is referred to as scoring, either by humans or a computer, or again, sometimes both. In animals, we can score behaviors including time spent in a given area, or grooming, eating, or drinking behaviors, and more. In humans, we can score behaviors including interactions with people, objects, situations, and the environment, and more. Although many aspects of behavioral research cannot be automated by AI or machine learning, as the behaviors of an individual subject are typically unpredictable in many cases, the tracking and scoring of behavior has become increasingly automated by AI and machine learning softwares. Scoring videos of research subject behaviors can be an incredibly time-consuming and tedious task, but there are many programs available now that can automatically count these behaviors on behalf of a researcher. The researcher typically labels the key body parts or movements the program should track, like we can see here in this picture, and once trained, the system can measure these behaviors reliably and much more efficiently than manual scoring. Another way we can visualize behavior is through the collection of certain types of responses through computers or various machines. In animals, we can collect data on quantities of nose pokes, lever presses, vocalizations, eye movements, and more. And in humans, we can collect data on quantities of lever pressing, verbal responses, eye movements, and electrodermal activity, which is a measure of sweat gland activity and is linked to sympathetic nervous system activity. And there's lots else that we can measure from humans as well. As many of the methods we can use to study how behavior impacts neural activation in animals involve methodology that will be covered in other lectures in the sci-MI program, I'm just going to briefly go over this slide and the next one. So while an animal is conducting a behavior, there are a few ways that we can directly measure changes in the brain. First, we can record electrical activity from specific neurons using electrophysiology. Second, we can measure chemical changes in the brain, such as neurotransmitter or hormone levels, using methods like microdialysis. And finally, we can use microscopy-based imaging techniques, such as calcium imaging, to watch the activity of individual neurons in real time while the animal behaves. These approaches let researchers link specific neural signals to behavior as it happens. Now, in both humans and animals, we can measure brain activity while a subject is behaving using several non-invasive imaging techniques. fMRI detects changes in blood flow in different brain regions, which reflect changes in neural activity. EEG measures the brain's electrical signals from the surface of the head, and PET uses small amounts of radioactive tracers to measure metabolic activity in the brain. For behavioral research, it's important that the subject can behave as naturally as possible during these scans. This is especially challenging with animals because we can't instruct them to stay still or follow directions inside the machines. As a result, researchers are constantly developing new systems that allow animals to move more freely while brain activity is being recorded, and we can see examples of this in the EEG and PET sections on this slide. And as a fun current research example, this is a prototype of an fMRI system that's being produced to allow mice to be awake and fully behaving while inside the scanner. And now we'll talk about some conclusions. So studying behaviors allows us to understand more complicated concepts like learning, memory, emotions, and so much more. We can observe, change, and measure behavior, and also see how the brain changes during behavior. And together, these approaches can help us to understand both healthy brains and the basis of neurological and psychiatric disorders. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'm just going to go through my reference slides now. And thank you for listening.